The cool breeze of a late summer evening brushed against Daniel's face as he strolled through the quiet streets of Willow Creek, a neighborhood he rarely visited. Clad in a plain hoodie and jeans, he carried himself with calm confidence, his sharp eyes scanning mailboxes and houses with precision. To the casual observer, Daniel might seem out of place, and someone was indeed watching. Parked discreetly at the corner, Officer Mitchell sipped his lukewarm coffee, his patrol car idling. When his gaze landed on Daniel, his instincts immediately went into overdrive. A lone man jotting notes near a mailbox at nearly midnight. It didn't sit right. Mitchell muttered, "What's this guy up to?" His grip tightened on the steering wheel. He flicked on his headlights and rolled forward, his suspicion growing. Daniel paused momentarily under the harsh light, his movements deliberate, as if aware he was being watched. Mitchell stepped out, his hand brushing his holster, the weight of authority clear in his voice. "Hey you," he called sharply. "What are you doing here?" Daniel turned slowly, his calm gaze meeting the officer's. "Evening, officer. Just working," he replied, his tone steady. Mitchell's suspicion deepened. "Work? You live around here?" Daniel shook his head. "No, but—" "Then why are you here?" Mitchell snapped, stepping closer. The tension thickened, shadows stretching under flickering streetlights. Daniel's steady demeanor seemed to unnerve Mitchell further, his frustration bubbling over as he barked, "You need to explain yourself now, or we've got a problem." Daniel's voice stayed firm, but the invisible line of mistrust had already been drawn, setting the stage for a confrontation neither man could avoid. Daniel held his ground, his posture steady despite the growing tension. Officer Mitchell took another step forward, his tone sharpened by years of suspicion. "I asked you a question," he barked, his hand lingering near his holster. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Daniel met Mitchell's gaze, his voice calm but edged with resolve. "I'm not breaking any laws, officer. I'm working on a sensitive project. That's all." Mitchell's eyes narrowed, his grip tightening. "Sensitive, huh? Sounds more like evasive to me. What's in that notebook?" Daniel instinctively clutched the small notepad closer to his chest. "It's private. I don't need to show it to you unless you have a warrant." That answer tipped Mitchell over the edge. "Listen, smart guy," he growled, stepping closer. "I'm not playing games. Hand it over." When Daniel didn't move, Mitchell's patience snapped. He grabbed Daniel's arm, his frustration boiling into action. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." Daniel pulled his arm back sharply, his voice rising for the first time. "I'm not resisting, but you're crossing a line, officer." The street seemed to hold its breath, the faint rustle of leaves and distant hum of traffic amplifying the standoff. Mitchell reached for his radio, his tone urgent. "Suspicious individual refusing to comply. Requesting backup at Hawthorne Street." Within minutes, red and blue lights illuminated the neighborhood as another patrol car arrived. A younger officer, barely into his 30s, stepped out, his face a mix of concern and uncertainty. "What's going on here?" he asked, his eyes flicking between Mitchell and Daniel. Mitchell jabbed a thumb toward Daniel. "This guy's been creeping around, refusing to explain himself. I asked for his notebook, and he's refusing. Suspicious as hell." The younger officer frowned. "Has he broken any laws?" Mitchell shot him a withering glare. "He's resisting, that's enough for me." Daniel exhaled deeply, his patience fraying. "Officer, I'm not resisting anything. I've cooperated as much as the law requires. I have rights and you're violating them." The younger officer's unease grew, but he said nothing. Mitchell, however, was undeterred. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," he ordered, his voice cold and unyielding. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he complied. As the cuffs clicked into place, he said evenly, "You're making a mistake." Mitchell smirked, guiding him toward the squad car. "We'll see about that." The ride to the station was suffocatingly silent. Mitchell, riding high on self-righteousness, cast occasional glances in the rearview mirror as though expecting Daniel to break. Daniel, however, stared out the window, his face unreadable but his mind clearly working. At the station, Mitchell marched Daniel through the fluorescent-lit hallways, gripping his arm tightly. Behind the reception desk, Sergeant Taylor, a seasoned officer with tired eyes, looked up with mild curiosity. "What's this about?" she asked, eyeing Daniel with measured skepticism. Caught him prowling around Hawthorne Street, Mitchell declared, puffing out his chest. Refused to explain himself or hand over his notebook. Suspicious behavior all around. Taylor raised an eyebrow. Did he resist? Mitchell hesitated, then muttered, "Not physically." Daniel finally spoke, his tone calm but firm. "I was standing on a public sidewalk, officer. I wasn't breaking any laws. This man decided that wasn't good enough for him." Taylor sighed, clearly accustomed to diffusing heated exchanges. "All right, let's process him and figure this out." As Mitchell led Daniel toward the holding area, a tall man in a crisp suit appeared at the end of the hallway. His presence commanded attention, his badge clipped neatly to his belt. "What's going on here?" the man asked, his voice calm but authoritative. Mitchell stiffened. "Just processing a suspicious individual." The man's gaze shifted to Daniel. Recognition flashed across his face. "Daniel?" Daniel's lips curved into a faint smile. "Evening, Agent Holloway." Mitchell froze, his grip loosening on Daniel's arm. "Wait, what?" Holloway's expression hardened as he turned to Mitchell. "This man is an FBI agent, working an undercover operation. What exactly do you think you're doing?" Mitchell stammered, his confidence unraveling. He wouldn't say who he was." "Did you ask?" Daniel interjected, his voice cutting through the officer's excuses. Holloway's glare deepened. "Do you have any idea how close you came to compromising months of work?" Mitchell's face turned pale. I didn't know." "You didn't bother to know," Holloway snapped. "And now, thanks to you, we might have lost critical intel." The air in the room grew heavy as Mitchell's world began to crumble. For the first time, the weight of his actions bore down on him, but the damage had already been done. The tension in the station was palpable. Officer Mitchell stood frozen, his face drained of color as the weight of his mistake hit him like a freight train. FBI agent Holloway's eyes remained locked on Mitchell, his stern gaze a mixture of anger and disappointment. "Sergeant Taylor," Holloway called over his shoulder, his voice calm but commanding. "I want a full incident report on my desk by morning, and I expect transparency. No corners cut." Sergeant Taylor nodded stiffly, scribbling notes in her pad. "Understood, Agent." Meanwhile, Daniel, now free of handcuffs, adjusted his hoodie and turned to Mitchell. "You didn't just detain the wrong person tonight, Officer Mitchell," he said, his voice low but cutting. "You nearly dismantled an operation months in the making. And for what? A hunch? A bias?" Mitchell's mouth opened, but no words came out. His mind scrambled for an excuse, a justification, but nothing seemed sufficient. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint hum of fluorescent lights above. Holloway turned to Mitchell, his tone cold and unforgiving. "Do you even understand the consequences of your actions tonight? Do you know what you jeopardized? This wasn't just about one person, officer. We were on the brink of cracking a case tied to a trafficking ring that's destroyed countless lives." Mitchell swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I didn't know," he finally muttered, his voice barely audible. "You didn't ask," Daniel interjected sharply, stepping forward. His calm demeanor was gone, replaced by a fiery intensity. "You assumed. You saw me, decided I didn't belong, and acted on nothing but your own prejudice. You abused your power." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Other officers in the station exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of the confrontation spreading like wildfire. Mitchell's defensiveness faltered, replaced by a creeping sense of shame. Holloway straightened, his gaze unwavering. "Sergeant Taylor, I'll also need a review of this officer's entire record. If this is how he conducts himself, I'd wager this isn't the first time he's acted out of line." Taylor hesitated, then nodded. "I'll get on it." Mitchell's face darkened. "This is a witch hunt," he snapped, his voice rising. "I was doing my job, protecting the neighborhood." Daniel let out a humorless laugh. "Protecting? Is that what you call this? Do you even understand what you've done? Because of your actions, key targets may have been spooked. The people we were watching, they'll scatter. Months of surveillance, planning, and coordination, wasted." Mitchell clenched his fists. "I made a mistake, all right, but I'm not the bad guy here." "No," Holloway said coldly, stepping closer. "You're the problem. You're the reason trust between law enforcement and communities is broken. You're the reason good officers have to fight twice as hard to do their jobs." Mitchell looked away, unable to meet Holloway's gaze. The younger officer who had responded earlier stood nearby, his discomfort evident. He finally spoke, his voice hesitant. "Agent Holloway, is there any way to salvage the operation?" Holloway exhaled sharply, his frustration simmering. "We'll try, but the damage is done. It's unlikely our targets will resurface anytime soon." Daniel crossed his arms, his expression grim. "And let's not forget the bigger picture. What about the next person Mitchell stops? The next person who isn't an FBI agent with a badge to shield them? What happens to them?" Mitchell flinched at the words, the harsh truth cutting deeper than he cared to admit. The station fell into an uncomfortable silence, the weight of accountability looming over everyone present. Holloway turned to Taylor. "This needs to be addressed immediately. The department must take responsibility, and changes need to be made. Mandatory bias training, oversight committees, whatever it takes to ensure this doesn't happen again." Taylor nodded, her face grim. "We'll get started." Daniel stepped back, his voice calmer now but no less firm. "I'm not here to ruin careers, but accountability matters. This isn't just about tonight. It's about making sure officers like Mitchell understand the weight of their decisions." Holloway placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You've made your point, Agent. Let's focus on damage control." As Daniel and Holloway left the station, the officers left behind were silent, the gravity of the night sinking in. Mitchell slumped into a chair, his head in his hands, the realization of how badly he had miscalculated hitting him like a ton of bricks. The fallout came swiftly. An internal affairs investigation was launched, uncovering a troubling pattern in Mitchell's record: repeated complaints of profiling and overreach. The department announced new policies, including mandatory bias training and the establishment of a civilian oversight board. Mitchell, placed on administrative leave, faced an uncertain future. For Daniel, the night was a bitter reminder of the work still left to do. As he prepared to continue his mission, he couldn't shake the thought of how easily the situation could have escalated further. The system wasn't just flawed, it was dangerous, and fixing it would take more than one night. But as he walked into the cool night air, he knew one thing for certain: change was coming, and it started here. The days following the incident at the station were anything but quiet. News of Officer Mitchell's arrest of an undercover FBI agent spread like wildfire, sparking outrage and debate across the small town of Willow Creek. Local newspapers ran headlines such as "Bias on the Beat," "Officer's Arrest Raises Questions About Policing," and "FBI Agent Detained, a Case of Misjudgment or Systemic Failure." Community leaders, activists, and even the mayor weighed in, calling for transparency and reform. Inside the Willow Creek Police Department, the atmosphere was tense. Officers whispered in hallways, exchanging uneasy glances whenever Mitchell walked by. He had been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of an internal affairs investigation, but his presence still loomed like a storm cloud. The weight of the scrutiny was unbearable for many, and for Mitchell, it was suffocating. Meanwhile, Agent Daniel Carter was back at work, though the events of that night lingered in his mind. As much as he tried to focus on the broader mission, he couldn't shake the memory of Mitchell's actions and what they represented. This wasn't just about him, it was about a system that allowed officers like Mitchell to wield their authority without accountability. At the police department, Sergeant Taylor led the investigation into Mitchell's record. The findings were damning. A pattern of complaints emerged. Instances where Mitchell had detained individuals based on little more than a gut feeling. Many of those individuals shared one commonality: they didn't look like they belonged in certain neighborhoods. Though most complaints had been dismissed due to lack of evidence, the pattern was undeniable now that it was laid bare. The findings ignited a firestorm within the community. Town hall meetings grew packed with residents, eager to voice their frustrations and demand change. One evening, Daniel himself attended one of these meetings, sitting quietly in the back, as locals shared stories of their own encounters with biased policing. An elderly man stood, his voice trembling with emotion. "I've lived here for 40 years, he said. but I still get stopped like I'm a stranger in my own town." A young woman spoke next, recounting how she was pulled over 3 times in 1 month for no apparent reason. "They never said I did anything wrong," she said, her voice breaking. "They just asked where I was going, like I didn't belong." Daniel listened intently, his heart heavy with the weight of their stories. When the mayor took the podium, he announced the implementation of new measures: mandatory bias training for all officers, the establishment of a civilian oversight board, and a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior. Back at the station, Mitchell sat in a small, windowless room, awaiting his final meeting with Internal Affairs. His once confident demeanor had crumbled under the pressure. He was no longer the respected officer he believed himself to be. He was a man facing the consequences of his actions. When the door opened, it was Daniel who walked in alongside Agent Holloway. Mitchell's eyes widened in surprise. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Daniel sat down across from him, his expression unreadable. "I'm here because this isn't just about me," he said. "It's about every person you've ever detained without cause. It's about the trust you've broken, not just with the community, but with your colleagues." Mitchell looked away, his jaw tightening. "I was doing my job," he muttered. "I was trying to protect people." "You were protecting your assumptions," Daniel said sharply. "You saw me and decided I was a threat without asking a single question. That's not protecting anyone. That's profiling." Holloway stepped in, his tone measured but firm. "Mitchell, this investigation isn't just about holding you accountable. It's about setting a precedent. What happened that night can't happen again, not here, not anywhere." Mitchell slumped in his chair, the weight of their words pressing down on him. For the first time, he seemed to grasp the gravity of his actions. Not just the immediate consequences, but the broader harm he had caused. The investigation concluded with Mitchell's formal dismissal from the force. The department released a public statement, acknowledging the failures that had allowed such behavior to persist and promising to rebuild trust with the community. For many, it was a bittersweet moment. Justice, but at a cost. Daniel, however, saw it as a beginning. In the months that followed, he continued his work with the FBI, but he also found himself drawn to the community's efforts to create change. He attended meetings, spoke with local leaders, and even participated in the first bias training session for officers. His presence served as a reminder that accountability was possible and that progress, while slow, was achievable. For Willow Creek, the incident became a turning point. The police department's reforms, though far from perfect, marked a step forward. And for Mitchell, now just another man in the crowd, the experience forced him to confront the biases he had ignored for so long. Stripped of his badge, he began to see the world through the eyes of those he once dismissed, a lesson he would carry for the rest of his life. As for Daniel, the night of his arrest remained a vivid memory, a stark reminder of the work still left to do. But as he walked through the bustling streets of a new assignment, he carried with him a quiet resolve. Change wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. And it started with accountability, one step at a time. Months had passed since the night of Daniel Carter's wrongful arrest in Willow Creek. The aftermath of the incident rippled through the town, sparking a wave of self-reflection, debate, and action. For many, it was a wake-up call, a stark reminder of the biases and systemic failures that had festered beneath the surface for far too long. The Willow Creek Police Department was no longer the same. The Civilian Oversight Board had been established, its members a diverse group of community leaders, activists, and even former officers. Their mission was clear: to hold the department accountable and ensure transparency in all operations. Meetings were open to the public, and attendance was high, with residents eager to contribute their voices. Inside the department, the changes were tangible. Officers underwent mandatory bias and de-escalation training, led by experts who didn't shy away from uncomfortable truths. The sessions were grueling, forcing participants to confront their own prejudices and question long-held beliefs. For some, it was an eye-opening experience. For others, like Officer Mitchell, it was a bitter pill to swallow. Mitchell, no longer part of the force, struggled to adjust to life without his badge. His dismissal had been swift and final, a consequence of his actions that night. He spent his days avoiding the stares of neighbors and former colleagues, their judgment a constant reminder of his fall from grace. Yet, as much as he tried to push it aside, the words Daniel had spoken to him lingered in his mind. "You're the problem," Daniel had said, his voice steady but cutting. "But you don't have to stay that way." At first, Mitchell resented those words, seeing them as an indictment of his entire career. But as weeks turned into months, resentment gave way to reflection. One day, almost on impulse, he walked into a local community center hosting a discussion on policing and bias. He sat quietly in the back, listening as residents shared their experiences and frustrations. Their stories mirrored the ones he had dismissed for years, accounts of fear, mistrust, and injustice. For the first time, Mitchell began to understand. He wasn't just confronting his own failures, but also the broader system that had shaped him. He started attending more meetings, speaking less, and listening more. Over time, he found himself volunteering at the center, mentoring at-risk youth and sharing his story as a cautionary tale. It wasn't redemption, but it was a start. Meanwhile, Daniel continued his work with the FBI, though he remained connected to Willow Creek. The case he had been working on the night of his arrest had eventually led to arrests and the dismantling of a trafficking ring, a victory that underscored the stakes of his mission. Yet, despite his success, Daniel couldn't ignore the impact of what had happened in Willow Creek. He began collaborating with local leaders, lending his expertise to help reform policing practices. He participated in town hall discussions, speaking candidly about his experience and the systemic changes needed to prevent future injustices. His calm demeanor and willingness to engage earned him the respect of the community, even among those who had initially viewed him with suspicion. One evening, at a packed town hall meeting, Daniel took the stage. He looked out at the crowd, his expression resolute. "What happened to me that night wasn't just about one officer," he began. "It was about a system that allows assumptions and biases to go unchecked. But what we've seen here in Willow Creek proves that change is possible. It starts with accountability. It starts with all of us." The room erupted in applause, but Daniel wasn't finished. "This isn't the end of the work. It's just the beginning. We have to keep pushing, keep questioning, and keep holding ourselves and each other to a higher standard. Because that's the only way we build a better future." In the weeks that followed, Willow Creek became a model for reform. Other towns and cities took notice, adopting similar measures and reaching out to Daniel and the Oversight Board for guidance. The story of Willow Creek, once a symbol of division and failure, transformed into one of hope and progress. As for Mitchell, he continued his quiet work at the community center, his once proud posture replaced by a humility born of hard lessons. He still carried the weight of his past actions, but he channeled that weight into making amends, one small step at a time. Daniel, reflecting on everything that had unfolded, understood that the journey was far from over. The fight for justice and equity wasn't a single battle. It was a lifelong commitment. But as he walked through the streets of Willow Creek, now bustling with energy and unity, he felt a sense of purpose. Change had taken root, and while it wasn't perfect, it was real. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel allowed himself a moment to hope. Hope that what started in Willow Creek could spread, turning one community's turning point into a movement for change across the nation. The fluorescent lights of the station flickered faintly as Daniel Carter sat calmly in the holding cell, his expression unreadable. Officer Mitchell stood at the front desk, exuding misplaced confidence. "Another suspicious guy off the streets," he muttered, oblivious to the storm brewing. Moments later, the door to the precinct opened and a man in a sharp suit strode in. His badge, clipped to his belt, caught the light. Agent Holloway's authoritative presence immediately shifted the energy in the room. "Where's Daniel Carter?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the murmurs. Mitchell stiffened. "The guy in the cell? What's it to you?" "That guy," Holloway snapped, "is an FBI agent working undercover. You just jeopardized an entire operation." Mitchell's face turned pale. "He didn't say who he was. Did you ask?" Holloway's glare could pierce steel. Minutes later, Daniel emerged from the cell, his calm composure intact. "Officer Mitchell," he said evenly, "your assumptions didn't just inconvenience me. They risked the lives of others." The weight of Daniel's words hung in the air as Holloway addressed the sergeant. "I want this incident fully documented. Accountability starts now. Mitchell's self-righteous facade crumbled as the reality of his actions began to sink in.